Hello and welcome to Catalyst Conversations. Today I'm joined by Jan Breckenridge, who's a Professor of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales. Jan is one of Australia's leading experts in domestic and family violence, which means she's an advisor to both government and private sector organisations, not only on best practice policies, but equally on best practice response and support. Jan, we're all in the same storm. Exactly how big is the problem when it comes to domestic violence in Australia right now?
Well, I think this is the most shocking part, is when you realise how prevalent domestic and family violence is. What I'm about to say will be an underestimate, because we're only looking at people who live together or have been in an intimate partnership where they've been a de facto or married. But 1 in 4 men and 1 in 13 men have experienced violence by an intimate partner since the age of 15 years. And that equates to 2.2 million women in Australia, or, just over 700,000 men have experienced this kind of violence. 1 woman is killed every 9 days, and 1 man is killed every 29 days, either by a partner or by an ex-partner or relative of their intimate partner, usually a woman. If we look at emotional abuse and neglect, 1 in 4 Australian women have reported experiencing that by a current or former partner, and 1 in 6 Australian men. And if you then drill down again and look at economic abuse, you've got 1 out of 10 people have experienced some form of economic or financial abuse from their partner. And, that's an incredible number of people who are affected by this issue. It must be one of the most pressing and prevalent issues in Australia today.
For all the employers and organisations who are watching and listening to this, what are the key basic principles, policies that every organisation in this country should have in place? What are the foundations that an employer should have?
Okay, if I were to summarise, say, 5 basic components of a good response or a best practice response. The first one that I think, and I think it is the foundation of a good response, is strong organisational leadership and commitment. I think for a CEO or a senior leader within an organisation to get up and say, I want to be part of a movement to reduce or prevent or have zero tolerance to domestic and family violence, is a massive importance for the organisation, because it sets the tone. And all of the employees, and if we go back to the prevalence, we know there have to be a number of employees who are both affected by or perpetrating domestic and family violence. So to have your CEO stand up, really, really important commitment. And I think that commitment has to be more than symbolic. I think then resources have to be designated. And I think the first thing I would say is that you need a policy. You need to have guidelines, operational mechanisms to manage any kind of disclosure within the organisation, either by employees or it could be customers. And you need to have a best practice response to employees who are perpetrators. And at different points that will come up, often indirectly, but often when it comes up, there's certainly a risk to reputation of the organisation. An organisational response framework. So who's going to manage your disclosures? How will privacy be managed? Who will manage workplace accommodations and flexible work arrangements? Who's going to review at what point? Who needs to know? And then, of course, it cascades down to training. And you do need a first responder and managerial level HR staff who are able to make a workplace response. And to know how to refer on to specialist help for domestic and family violence. Pardon me. And then you need a communication plan, because you can do all of these things, and if your employees don't know that you're doing them and you haven't got a presence of this response either on your intranet or other type of internal communications, then staff won't know and they won't be able to access the help that may be there. So if you sort of bundle all of that together, it's about also understanding what a workplace response is. I don't think organisations should be counsellors. I don't think they should be trying to solve domestic and family violence. And for very many people who are affected, it may not affect their work. So organisations only get involved where there's an effect on the workplace, and their response should be tailored to that workplace response. How do you help people either stay in their employment? And staying in employment means they can probably stay in their housing, they can leave a violent and abusive relationship, and they can remain independent from the person who's perpetrating violence and abuse. And it gives them financial resources to be able to have some kind of future well-being and happy existence.
Wow. So just to recap there, so leadership's sort of commitment and role modelling at CEO level, policies obviously in place, response frameworks, and the appropriate communication plan.
And training. I think, you know, people are often quite scared of getting into responding to domestic and family violence. And I think the first thing I say to everybody is you actually respond to really difficult employee issues all the time. Mm-hmm. What you're responding to is an employee issue only and if it affects the workplace. And then your response is tailored to that. Part of a good response is referring out for other specialist help for the DV and understanding safety. But actually, you're there to help them stay in employment. And that's what managers and HR staff should do best.
Yeah, absolutely. So if that's the basics, can you tell us what progressive looks like? Can you give us an example of what a progressive organisation is doing in this?
Look, I would think a progressive organisation would do all of those things, but this is a journey. Organisational change and change in culture, both in our community but also in our workplaces, doesn't happen easily. People's attitudes around domestic and family violence, the shame that some of the employees may experience at being a victim or affected by domestic and family violence, they're the things that need to be overcome. And I guess for an organisation to be seen to be responding both within the broader community, and it could be things like taking on, and I'm just thinking of some of the best practice responses I've seen, but working with specialist domestic and family violence organisations at a national level, say funding short videos that can be used in workplace training, but could also exist for the rest of the community. It could be sharing resources with other organisations. And what I've seen with Male Champions of Change, and I've also seen it through various other organisations, and CBA are certainly a thought leader with this, where they share their response for other organisations to consider and to think how it would apply to their very particular work circumstance.
Is language something we need to think about here? I mean, you know, we hear words like perpetrator and victim. Is there a right language and a wrong language that companies should be aware of?
I think these are really difficult issues, and I'm not sure I can give you an answer that is really satisfactory. I think a lot of people don't like being called a victim because it suggests they've got no agency or capacity to progress, that they're stuck back, and that they'll always be a victim to something that they want to move on from, frankly. Although some people will say, well, actually, that's exactly how I feel. Often you'll see people talk about survivors of domestic and family violence. Our business tends to talk more around about people affected, and I think we do that because we recognise a much broader range of people who can be affected by domestic and family violence. It's not just in intimate partner violence, which is often really what people are referring to when they talk about domestic violence. They really mean between partners. But there's abuse of older people. There can be parents whose young people, children, can be violent towards them or abusive. You know, there's also same-sex and gender-diverse couples that are not always covered in the violence against women intimate partner frame. So when you talk about people affected, it allows there to be a much greater appreciation of the effects of domestic and family violence. And one of the most moving and powerful things that I saw was a senior manager in one organisation who actually stood up and was introducing training that we were running for the organisation. And he said, I just want people to know that this is relevant to all of us. And he said, I grew up in a home where there was domestic violence on a daily basis. So I am someone affected by domestic and family violence. And I want to tell everybody in this organisation, it is never okay. And everyone just sat there, and it was so moving and so powerful. So I guess language is important, because had we talked about victim, I don't know that he would have seen himself as a victim. And I don't know that would have captured that he was affected, but not necessarily directly the target of the violence and abuse.
Well, that's a great insight for the communications plan. Jan, you're clearly a fountain of very valuable knowledge. If you're okay, you know, and for those of you watching at home, if you'd like to be connected with Jan to explore this a little bit further, let us know, if that's okay with you, Jan.
You know, if you had have said to me a number of years ago, I would be working with corporate clients, I would not have thought that would be possible. And this last number of years, probably since 2014, it's been some of my most enjoyable contacts, has been working with corporate clients around looking at their organisational response.
That's wonderful to hear. Now, look, last question, because I have to ask everybody that I interview this one. If you could travel back in time and visit yourself at the beginning of your amazing career, what advice would you give yourself?
I would say to myself, be very, very grateful that you have been lucky enough to do something that you love. Be grateful. And I would also say that always look for the best in another organisation, in another person, in another group. Very often with these kind of issues, it's very easy to be divided about different attitudes, different beliefs. And I've learnt that, and what I would like to say to myself back then is just be a little less rigid about what you think. Listen to another perspective and try and understand what that perspective means to that person. It doesn't mean that I have to agree, but, you know, people come on board slowly. And if you are always respectful, you get the best out of people. And I think in my earlier activist days, I perhaps was more unforgiving than I should have been.
Thank you for sharing that, Jan. That's a great reflection and some wise words. Is there a question I should have asked you that I haven't?
No, I don't. I think I feel like we've covered a lot. I guess the one thing that we could have looked at a little bit more was, why should organisations do this? And, you know, I do think that there are really good financial reasons. You know, if you've got employees who are not firing on all cylinders, if they're absent for a lot of the time, or they're there but they're not really there, you're not going to have a productive business. But I also think there's issues around, we all want a socially just world. We all want to have a fair world. And so organisations are part of that community response to domestic and family violence. They're critical. So I would just encourage everyone to really think about and start. You don't have to go into all of the 5 areas that I've said straight away. You know, you can build your response, but to really hop on board and see what you can do, because it's incredibly important.
As you said, I mean, this is a journey, and, you know, everybody's at different parts of that journey. But I think looking at it through, like you said, 2 lenses: performance, but equally social justice. And I think, you know, this has been a fantastic interview. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing. And I know this will make a big difference in the work you're doing and have been doing is making a phenomenal difference. So thank you.
Thanks, Ben.